Hello there, welcome to a special programme looking at the future of cricket following the racism scandal which has engulfed the sport. Coming up, we will hear from a host of guests, including West Indian World Cup winner Carlos Brathwaite and Cricket Wales board member Samara Afzal. This programme was broadcast before the England and Wales Cricket Board published their action plan for improving diversity in the sport.
This is 5 Live Sport
with Steve Crossman.
For the next hour, we're going to be talking about the future of cricket. It's been 9 days now since the former Yorkshire cricketer Azeem Rafiq's testimony to Parliament shook the sporting world and beyond. Tonight, we're going to be looking at how cricket moves forward, what comes next, how it can be made inclusive for all. With us tonight, we've got BBC Asian Network presenter and reporter Ankur Desai, who has been right across this story. Ankur, good evening.
Good evening, Steve. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. You haven't just come off air again, have you? You seem to spend your entire time on the radio at the moment.
I don't know. I think literally between 5 Live and the Asian Network, I think the BBC are earning every ounce out of me at the moment. So I expect the cheque to be in the post, editors.
We've got a lot to get through in this, and I think the plan is kind of to look more forward than back because we're talking about potential solutions. That said, we are here because of Azeem Rafiq's testimony, and I know you know Azeem well, so I just wonder how it felt for you listening to him speak.
It was difficult, actually, because I've got to hear him talk on a personal level off the record quite explicitly, but I think there were certain things even we didn't really hover over because I sensed it was going to be difficult for him to talk about. And we've done a few interviews on the record where he has broke down. And I don't want to be someone who's that guy who brings tears before bedtime. But unfortunately, with those interviews, it was a bit like that. And even subsequently, it's been like that. So I was surprised with some of the testimony that came out because I didn't quite understand the detail and the depth that some of his experiences went to. But ultimately, it was an experience which was difficult for me to sort of digest because I think a lot of British Asians have subsequently reached out to me and said, and have before in the past, Steve, and said, well, look, these are experiences which we're quite familiar with. We've just not felt comfortable enough to talk about them.
Delighted to say that also with us for the next hour, we have West Indies World Cup winner Carlos Brathwaite. Carlos, good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening. How are you?
I'm good. Between my makeshift mic, my Lord's seat, and twisting my neck in one direction to be able to get good volume, all is well.
apart from that. And listen, I can't tell you how much we enjoyed, having you throughout the entirety of the World T20, and some of the insight, some of the entertainment was absolutely brilliant. This, of course, is a completely different story, and it's a completely different programme. So I'll ask you the same question that I asked Ankur. When you heard what Azeem Rafiq was saying, what did it do to you inside? How did it feel?
It's a funny one because you never want to judge persons and, have them guilty until proven so. So for me, it was very difficult to listen to him and some of the names called, the persons that I would have interacted with, and some people that I actually really like and fairly close to. So to hear some of the allegations, it always makes you look back and wonder, did I see anything of the sort? And then one thing my mum told me was, don't pick up fire rage, and that's Caribbean parlance. And basically, if someone has treated you well or been good to you, don't hate them just because they haven't been good to someone else. So that's a battle that you fight with daily because racism is not something that has happened to someone else. It just hasn't happened to you yet. So for me, it was 6 of one, half dozen the next. I found it hard to listen to because obviously a fellow professional cricketer and a fellow human being went through something like that pushed him to the brink of taking his own life, which I thought was real deep. And then hearing about the subsequent pressures after losing a newborn. And that really hit home for me because me and my wife have been trying and we had 2 miscarriages, so I know how deeply that impacts your family, your spouse, and the type of mental toll that it can take. So for him to go through that and then go back to work, which you want to think of cricket and your workplace as somewhere that you can get away from the pressures of life, and then you've just had a big pressure, a big, I don't want to call it negative, but a big loss, and you go into the workplace and the workplace compounds it and makes it even worse. You just never want one of your peers, you never want to hear anyone at all really going through that. So it was deep, and I felt as though it was necessary. Within the last summer and Black Lives Matter taking the knee, it did have some momentum last summer. I think coming out of the summer, it sort of lost pace. And I think with these allegations, I'm not happy that they came up, because I'm not happy that someone went through them, or what was said. But the fact that it did come up at this point in time, when the taking the knee was becoming, in my opinion, a bit divisive, and it shouldn't have, it just caused everyone around the game to take a deeper look at themselves and start to question if taking the knee really is the issue, or if there's a more deep-seated issue in the game. And it's not only the county game. I think personally is a societal issue, not a cricket issue, but be it that we are talking about cricket, looking within the game and finding things that we call quote-unquote banter and take for a laugh, the way that it can negatively impact someone else. I think that was important to share. And I'm happy that we're having these sort of conversations now to educate not only persons of color, but white persons who would have the privilege of not going through that, coming up from primary school to secondary school to university through to the professional career, whether sport or otherwise.
I'm so sorry to hear about your personal struggle as well there, Carlos. And, you know, I think one of the things that's come out of Asim Rafiq is so many things that he said have spoken to so many people in so many different ways. And I think, Anchor, you know, what Carlos was saying there about societal issue versus sporting issue, you know, the great thing about sport is it can impact society, and historically has in a big way. So, you know, we're talking about action that is needed, and the ECB has an action plan, right?
They have a South Asian action plan, a South Asian action strategy, which they brought out 4 years ago, and it's something which a lot of people hope would have brought change, I suppose. Not overnight, because I don't think the British Asian community were expecting things to change immediately. But at the time, the plan was to integrate British Asians into the cricket fraternity, into the cricket family. So that means not just the number of Asian cricketers who are playing at a professional level, but number of Asian coaches who are working within cricket administration, maybe as people who can help talent ID young players, maybe people who wish to have aspirations to become a coach, maybe people who wish to work in cricket governance. I think British Asians thought we deserve a seat at the table. And when you see that 35% of British Asians play the game recreationally and only 4% end up playing it at a professional level, you're seeing only a microcosm, I think, there. It doesn't really go into the other structures of cricket, which British Asians felt that they weren't being represented at. And I think that's something which will be interesting to see how that develops as well going forward, because it's not just about how many British Asians can you see playing for England or playing at county level. I think it reaches wider than that.
And there's just been news quite literally today. Mahmouda Duke, who the chair of Leicestershire County Cricket Club, the only female Asian chair in the county game, she stepped down with immediate effect. She was due to leave in March, but she's brought that forward. And this is the statement that Mahmouda Duke released. Cricket has been torn apart by recent events. I'm deeply saddened by the hurt felt by individuals within our game. This is key. With fresh leadership at national level, and with a determination to learn from the recent past and move forward, I hope racism and discrimination will be expunged from dressing rooms, fields, and the game as a whole, allowing us to celebrate the diversity which makes cricket and sport in this country so great. Anchor, with fresh leadership at national level.
Absolutely. And at national level, we're talking the ECB, we're looking at the board. Lord Kamlesh Patel was the last British Asian who was represented on that board. His term finished, hasn't been replaced, and it shouldn't be just a like for like. It has to be representation based on merit, of course. But if there were more British Asians at that seat of that table, then that would make a difference. I think he's obviously moved over to become chairman at the moment at Yorkshire. That's another story in itself. But a seat at the table, I think, and a seat at the table which makes key decisions within the cricket framework in this country. And you look across other boards, how many British Asians are there at different counties around the country, how many coaches are there of the counties. We've got Vikram Solanki as one. I think that there's a lot to unpick from all of that.
Well, I'm delighted to say we have loads of great guests coming up, but let's speak first to Dr. Thomas Fletcher, who co-wrote a report in 2014 and then followed it up in 2020, a report about the inclusion of South Asian cricketers in the sport. Thomas, good evening.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
No, thank you for coming on. Where to start? 7 years ago. What did you find out 7 years ago?
Yeah, so we were commissioned by the ECB, so it was ECB funded, and it was a project specifically at the time to look at the experiences of South Asian cricket coaches, so those that were already qualified coaches and those that perhaps had aspirations of becoming coaches. The ECB identified, they released statistics that said, at least 30% of people that played cricket in this country were from a South Asian background. But I think at the time, 6% were qualified coaches. So again, not at a particular level, just in general held a qualification. So they want to know, obviously, how they could diversify that workforce in recognition that a diverse workforce creates a better working structure. We identified a variety of reasons why there was this drop-off from playing to coaching. Some of them were kind of specific to South Asian communities. Some were probably fairly representative across the board. So in terms of, issues around time and money and family commitments, which are not, ethnicity specific. And then there were some things that South Asians felt that, they were blocked off from the system, that as they entered the system, they were treated unfairly or discriminated against, or the coaching resources were not in a language that was, accessible necessarily, that their way of doing things, so their way of playing, their interpretations of the game were almost antithetical to the so-called, in inverted commas, English way of doing things. And therefore their experiences were not valued. And in short, we identified that this was a system that privileged whiteness, and that privileging of whiteness meant that the further through the system you went, the whiter it became. And that wasn't just in terms of participants, that was the coach educators, that was the network of people who helped you get into the system, etc., etc.
I just want to jump in with a question as well myself. In terms of when we look at it, Tom and I, just to add a bit of a caveat, we spoke just literally the other day on my program on the Asian Network, and we talked about how class and privilege also plays a major factor, which you touched upon there. I just wanted you to expand on that, because through the study, white British cricketers from private schools are 34 times more likely than young Asians to reach the elite level. And that just seemed to be such a damning statistic which came out of that.
Not to be ever so slightly embarrassing, that's not mine. So that's Tom Brown at Birmingham.
Sorry, apologies. That's what I meant. I meant the Tom Brown study.
No, it's fine. Again, I think this is really important though, because what we've got at the minute is we have a kind of we have a really good canon of evidence. So one that's, the work that I did, which was predominantly based at kind of grassroots, which is where we're talking about kind of culture and the pathways. And then you've got Tom's work, which is then looking at, specifically how do people progress through that system into the professional game. So for the first time since I started working in this environment back in 2007, when I did my PhD on this, we actually have evidence of those transitions from the different periods within the pathways. And so we're at a really pivotal time, really, in terms of where we actually have an evidence base to look at the different levels and the different routes. In terms of class and privilege, I mean, it does, they do obviously intersect with issues around race and ethnicity, because, the most impoverished people in this country also, it's no surprise to many that, disproportionately come from an ethnically diverse background. And, the traditional way of recruiting in cricket, particularly, young cricketers, the traditional pathway has been, we'll look at schools, the schools that have got the best facilities, the best programs, the best routes into clubs, and then the clubs that have got the best connections to the counties. And it'll come as no surprise to most that those kids that go through that pathway are those from privileged backgrounds. They're not from inner cities and, struggling to find a green space to play and struggling to find a club to access. These are predominantly white kids that go to not necessarily state schools, but often private schools, and they're privileged as a result of that.
Thomas, you said your report was sort of backed by the ECB, so presumably then your results went to the ECB. So then to hear Azim Rafiq speak 7 years later, does that suggest that what you said was ignored, or recommendations weren't taken up, or what? Because the way you were describing it in 2014 is effectively the way it's being described in 2021.
Yeah, it is, absolutely. I think what we have here, and I've in a way tried to be realistic about the scale and scope of that work. It was a relatively small piece of work in the grand scheme of things. We were told by the ECB that they wanted a couple of case studies. So we did a case study of Yorkshire and London. They were two of the ECB's target areas at the time. There were 5 at the time. So, Manchester, Birmingham, Leicester, etc. I think that's been expanded since. So it was relatively small in the grand scheme of things, but it was also very specific. This was around coaching pathways. The person that commissioned it was part of the kind of coaching pathways, I suppose, department, whatever it is, within the ECB. And it went to them, and they did whatever they did at local level from a coaching perspective. Now, my view on this has always been I'm realistic about how far these things would go. I was delighted to see the inclusion of many of the recommendations or the findings seem to be reflected in the South Asian Engagement Action Plan, which you've already mentioned. So, it's almost implicit that the evidence has been used in that respect. What I was most disappointed with, though, is when you then listen to the hierarchy, when they are put on the spot and asked about what are you doing to engage with, these communities? What are you doing, based on these recommendations? And they didn't know. Now, for me, that's just a case of, well, perhaps at the time you probably didn't need to read it and it wasn't really for your eyes. But if I was sat down in a parliamentary inquiry and knowing that I was going to be put on the spot, I'd have made sure that I got all of my pieces in order. So I think from an ECB perspective, that just showed probably just a lack of clarity and maybe probably for many reflected perhaps the marginal nature of the work. This is not something that is taken as seriously as other things. Otherwise, perhaps they would have been more clued up on it.
Would you say out of touch as well?
I just think, from my perspective, I look at the people at that hearing, I look at the people who head up the ECB, and I don't think that they think that equality and diversity is their job. I think the ECB is, I've spoken to a number of journalists, as you can imagine, over the last week or so, and I've asked the same question of them, and they've said the ECB is just this unwieldy, massive organisation, probably too big in its current kind of structure, and therefore the people who head up and strategise for it, they're interested in the commercial opportunities, they're interested in TV deals and tours and the England cricket team. What they're not, as you say, out of touch is probably fair, they're not necessarily asking what's happening at, in this village club in South Yorkshire, where I might go and take my kids, what's the dressing room culture there? And what's the impact of that dressing room culture as kids get picked up in the school system and then maybe into the county system and at, under 14, under 15, go into dressing rooms with these kind of views, having progressed through without their views being challenged at any point in time. And I think, the idea that a dressing room at professional level, where, racist, so-called inverted commas again, banter is acceptable, goes by unchallenged. Are we surprised? No, because it happens at every single level of the game. And unless it's challenged at the grassroots, then it's going to progress into the professional changing rooms and it becomes normalised there.
Carlos, what absolutely screams at me here is that it needs players. And this just takes us back again to the importance of Azim Rafiq, because, people like Dr. Thomas Fletcher, who's with us, can do a study and can say, listen, these are the problems. But I think it needs you guys as players, doesn't it? It needs people to stand up and effectively, blow a whistle to make a real difference.
Yeah, and as what you mentioned earlier, is societal, because everyone that walks into a dressing room walks off the street, figuratively speaking, walks from all walks of society. And if at a societal level it is adopted that you can't say certain things or you can't do certain things, then when you congregate in that dressing room, then that is the standard that everyone lives up to. It can't be a case where you walk off the road and only in this dressing room we have respect. Only in this dressing room we don't say certain things. Only in this dressing room we don't have banter. Because what will happen is then something will slip because it's out of character, and then 3 or 4 of the other people in the dressing room might have a giggle that sends a level of acceptance, and then all of a sudden that standard is changed. That is not the way to go about it, in my opinion. And I had a situation in Ireland where me and a white player, older guy, we were cool, and we used to share a couple phrases back and forth that in hindsight now I probably shouldn't have allowed, and I shouldn't have gone along with it from that end either. But we knew where we stood. We had conversations about it, and I think where we stepped over the mark was that we did it in public, and then someone overheard us, not a player but a member of staff at the club, and they decided to join in. And a couple of times it caught me off guard because I had accepted this from this person. This was our quote unquote banter we had amongst each other. And then someone else was like, it took me back a bit. And at that time I was 19, 20, my first professional contract. And I just remember like it happened for like a week max. And I got pulled aside by a couple of these senior guys. One was Australian, one had English heritage, and a couple Irish guys. I think one was Kiwi as well. So about five or six of these senior guys, and they were just like, it's come to our attention. Like a few of us have heard it, and one of the guys have reported it to us as well. That so and so says this in your direction, and we think that frankly it's overstepping the mark and it should not be allowed to be said. But we're also aware that you say X and Y and you have this quote-unquote banter with this player. So we come to you to find out if that was okay from your standpoint, or if you thought I overstepped the mark. And it's only then that I realized, you know what, like, I didn't feel disrespected by it because they say it was two friends. It was quote-unquote banter. We had an understanding because we spoke about it before we even started talking about it. And it wasn't derogatory words or anything. But it gave license to someone else who heard it to feel as though it was accepted and feel as though they can say it. So for me now, it would have been kind of hypocritical for me to say, oh, you can't say that, when you got your friend on your right hand, and you and him saying it and you're laughing and you're joking. So that there, I think, is a perfect scenario where on one hand, it is also what you allow, and where you draw the line. But on the other hand, it was the awareness of the senior guys in that dressing room to say, nah, that don't sit well with us. We don't think that should happen. And that is what I mean about it's a societal problem. If you have more senior guys in your dressing room calling out certain things, if they happen and they are seen, then it can't fly. It can't be seen as though it's accepted. Because if we see something that we think is wrong, we can go through certain channels, and we can make sure that we let the culprit know we don't stand for that. That's not what we stand for as a dressing room. And the dressing room then knows, boom, that can't be said, this can't be done, this is not how we live in this dressing room, this is not the standard. But it starts from the outside and comes into the dressing room. And I think cricket at the stage now where we're trying to say it starts in the dressing room and goes on the outside. And I think it's a little unfair on the game to expect that 11 guys in a dressing room are going to change a city before the city changes its ways and influences those 11 guys.
Well, the policing of it, Tom, can come from much higher than a dressing room, and it is coming now from much higher than a dressing room. I was reading what you wrote in The Guardian, actually arguing for a national inquiry into racism at all levels of the game. What do you think that would look like?
I'd love to have that conversation with somebody. You can obviously tell what I'm hankering after, can't you? As a researcher, for someone to say, Tom, do you want to go and find this out for us? I think the thing that strikes me about all of this is that it comes back to the point that was being made at the beginning around, just increasing numbers doesn't solve a problem, because, you can have 20% representation here, 50% representation there, or whatever the figures will be. But if people's experiences are negative or they experience discrimination in those roles, then their representation is, it's fruitless. It doesn't actually change the culture of things. For me, I think that there are going to be, for a start, there are different, as Carlos has mentioned, and by the way, it's a privilege to be on with Carlos, by the way. The fact that there are generational differences.
Everybody says that, Tom. He's bored of it.
Flattering me.
Oh, I'm just obviously bowled away by that. I think that there are massive generational differences for a start. There are cultural differences. There are geographic differences. There are, class-based differences here that I don't think that a one-size-fits-all, this is the approach that we're going to take, necessarily really captures the nuances that exist within local areas as well. So, I mean, I know what it's like to be having a conversation with, let's say, a white working-class 60-something from South Yorkshire. I know what they're, generally speaking, I can guess stereotypically what their views are. I can guess which way of the kind of political spectrum they lie. I could probably make a prediction vaguely based on whether they voted for Brexit or not, and all this kind of thing. And so for me, a national inquiry has to capture those nuances, because we know that that these cases are not specific to Yorkshire. Evidently, we've said that it would never be the case all along, but there will be things that are isolated to Yorkshire or specific to Yorkshire. There will be things that are specific to people living in Leicester or Birmingham, because of the nature of the experiences that people have gone through as they've progressed through the game. There are certain parts of the country where there is greater diversity. So, people experience that diversity, and they in a melting pot intermingle with these communities. If you're from, rural North Yorkshire, you're not experiencing that diversity. So if you're then thrust in a dressing room with people who are not like you, and when I say not like, in this case, I'm talking rural North Yorkshire, very white, and then suddenly these white kids are thrust into a dressing room where they might encounter some South Asian, communities. They might be Muslim, Hindu, Sikh, we don't know, and a couple of black kids, for instance. That I don't think that these kids often know how to deal with that situation, and therefore this is where we kind of revert back to stereotypes, and it might be common parlance or language. So again, so-called banter that they don't necessarily appreciate is something that's actually not acceptable in that environment, or actually could cause hurt to those people. Now, I was talking to someone at the BBC the other day who said, even reference to the P word for some is upsetting. Not even to actually say it in full, just to say P word, as opposed to say someone of Pakistani heritage. Just to make reference to what it represents is offensive. To say it in full is offensive. To some, it's not. But again, we need to understand the nuances, don't we, of how this kind of, this terminology plays out. But also, as Carlos says, there are boundaries, aren't there? There are kind of boundaries that you can push, and so far within certain environments. But we have to understand how far those boundaries can go, because, to go back to, say, my club and suddenly say, do you know what, you can't say that, or you can't do this, or you can't do that. You're fundamentally asking people to change something which last year wasn't a problem, or it wasn't perceived to be a problem. So there's a real kind of process of re-educating around what can be said, what can't be said, or indeed what can be said with somebody's consent. Understanding those boundaries, been comfortable to ask questions of one another's background, faith, culture, class, gender, sexuality, just being confident to have those conversations is a really important thing to do. And I don't think, without actually going away and understanding how these cultures play out, I don't think we can put any plan in place, because it's a plan based on no evidence. Tom, and that's what I would call for.
Tom, it's been brilliant to have you on. Thank you so much. And take care.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
That's Dr. Thomas Fletcher, co-wrote a report in 2014, updated in 2020 about the inclusion of South Asian cricketers in sport. We have the BBC Asian Network's Anchor Desai and Carlos Brathwaite with us on 5 Live Sport as we discuss the future of cricket. Let's bring in Dr. Samara Afzal, who's a board member for Cricket Wales and a former Warwickshire player. Samara, good evening.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening. So as an executive, as a coach, what changes would you like to see in cricket in the coming weeks, the coming months, the coming years?
So I think the most importantly, education. That's key. A lot of the examples that you hear, a lot of them are ignorance. It's not people being or trying to be malicious. Genuinely, some things are ignorance. And People, and I know the ECB are bringing in an anti-racism education program for players, officials, coaches and support staff, and that's very, very important. It's important to be transparent. If your club or your county has had a case being reported to you, it's very easy to try and hide it under the covers, pretend it didn't happen and brush it so that nobody finds out. But actually, it's very important to talk about it. So, Cricket Wales did a really good thing last Friday. They had an equalities, diversity, inclusive workshop. And this was, programmed in a lot before the news broke about Azim Rafiq. And in that, actually, they had a couple of players, South Asian players, former players, coaches, who actually, they recognised that they had faced discrimination. And they themselves approached Glamorgan Cricket, and Cricket Wales approached them and tried to understand what had happened. And now they've got them working with them to ensure that that doesn't happen again, and no other player, coach, official has to go through their experiences. And listening to them was heartbreaking. Listening to what Azim said in his testimony, that was absolutely heartbreaking. I don't know any South Asian or any person of black origin who hasn't suffered racism. Luckily for me, I haven't overtly suffered it in cricket, but in my profession as a GP, often patients say, I don't want to see a brown doctor, or I've been told to wash my hands twice because apparently brown people are dirty. So we've suffered that. We know how it feels, and it's horrible. And my thing on it is that if you can have, for example, counties, national boards, everybody before a tournament has lectures, for example, on anti-corruption. Why can't we have anti-discrimination lectures? I know it's, everybody says, but it's something so basic, but clearly it's not basic, and it should start right from grassroots level. Now there is good work happening, so Chance to Shine, All Stars, Dynamos, but actually start at that level, start educating those children, have policies in place. When parents bring children, and people who aren't children, they should have some sort of form. So at the beginning of the season, you shouldn't just have a membership form, pay your fees, and that's it. You turn up for matches, play and go home. That shouldn't be the case. You should actually, if anything, educate your players at the start of every season. Have a form, have a zero tolerance policy, have it in writing, get everybody to sign it. I think that's really, really important. Some people say it's too much, it's going to put people off cricket, but it's not actually. We've seen that it's just as menace on the sport as things like corruption is. So I think it's really important to educate people. I know they're giving bursaries to try and get more coaches from diverse backgrounds. Again, that's important because I think it's important for players to come and identify with other players and other coaches from their origin. And I saw something from Ajmal Shahzad, and I think Samit Patel said, part of the problem is Asian parents don't take cricket seriously and they want their kids to become doctors, etc., dentists. Yes, that's true, but we need to find out why. Why is it that they'd rather get them, for me, for example, when I started playing for Warwickshire, my family brushed it off. They just laughed. They said, as a brown person, you're never going to make it to the top. So, I was kind of pushed to concentrate on becoming a doctor and not focusing on cricket. It was just seen as the hobby. But we need to change that. We need to get, as Ankur mentioned, that 3 out of 10 players from the BAME background own recreational cricket. But why do we only see 4% in the county game? That needs to change. That really does. And it's not because they're not talented. They are talented. I've played in lots of diverse teams. I played for a team called Handsworth, and that was literally everybody from an Afro-Caribbean background and me. And I absolutely loved it. I got to learn so much about the Afro-Caribbean background. It was basically having a party every day. We had music, we had barbecues, and it was brilliant. And, and I think we need to push more and more clubs and people into these diverse backgrounds. And it's what, as the previous speaker, Dr. Tom, mentioned, that a lot of these players haven't played with anybody from a BAME background. So suddenly they don't know how to react. And the other thing, actually, the big thing is, alcohol is a big part of cricket and has been a big part of cricket. So, for example, even with me, when I played club cricket, at the end, you'd go to the bar for a drink. Often that's the time I would leave and go home. But when you've got more professional games, when you're going on tour, and then, if you're the player from the Muslim background, for example, who's leaving that club and then going back to the hotel, and you've got the others that are socializing with your coach, with your officials, and then actually you're in a dilemma where you've got two players of equal capability, but one you see every day in the evening, you socialize with them over alcohol, the other one, he's the guy who's always, or the girl who's always in the hotel. So, who are you going to pick out of those two? Who is it going to be easier to tell actually you're 12th person in tomorrow's game? So we have to deal with these kind of issues. We have to be more inclusive. So, for example, in Ramadan, I had a bleep test. I was trialing for a county, and I had a bleep test. I'd been up since 4 a.m, no fluids, no food, and I was told just get on with it. And I think today, that's in this day and age, it's not acceptable. We have to be, we have to recognise people's beliefs. We have to make, we have to be accommodating, so that we don't get another case like Azim. What he said about him not wanting his children to be in cricket is actually heartbreaking. And I've got a 5-year-old who's in All Stars, and I want her to go up, and I want her to play, and I want her to play county cricket. I don't want children to be put off with this. And actually now this has been a big hit, and I think everybody needs to work really, really hard. I know we as Cricket Wales have put out a strong statement today saying that we've got zero tolerance on any form of discrimination, where of course backing the ECB's plans, there'll be funding, there'll be lots of action plans in place to try and tackle this. I know changes won't happen straight away, it will take time, but actually Azim has done something very big. He's put this thing out there in the domain, in the public domain. People can now whistleblow. Whistleblowing in every profession is actually seen as a negative thing, but now more and more people are coming forward. We need to accept those stories. We need to listen to those stories. We need to make changes based on that. So I think every county has a duty now to listen to anybody who's faced any discrimination and see actually how can we turn this into a positive for the future.
So, Samara, I wanted to jump in because you and I talked on my programme and when we've met in person at cricket events about the role British Asians have to play in cricket. And a few things you pointed out there. Clubhouse culture is a big one, because a lot of people have said to me, a lot of clubs, they don't want to have Muslim players playing at their club because they're not going to put any money behind the bar. It's the same when they want to sign an overseas professional for the summer. And then we've heard a lot of testimony from Azim Rafiq and a lot of other people who've subsequently become whistleblowers who we've heard from in the last couple of weeks. And one of the big things I think the British Asian community are talking about is that word trust. How does cricket earn the trust back of British Asians? And you talked about a number of different issues there, but how does cricket regain the trust of the British Asian community? What do they need to do? It's all well and good we talk about having better diversity in the boardroom, for example, but then today we've heard of Mahmouda Duke leaving her role. We can talk about the fact that there needs to be an independent regulator possibly, but in order to bring that trust back, so parents are saying actually my child can have a future in cricket, or I will feel accepted in a cricket clubhouse. What does cricket need to do in order to gain the trust of an Asian community, British Asian community, which is so diverse when you look at it from a cultural perspective and a religious perspective as well?
So, again, we talked about this in detail at our board meeting yesterday, and one of the key things is transparency. So everything needs to be in the open for a start. Anything that any sanctions that are placed on any players or officials that have been found guilty, that needs to be open for the public to see. There needs to be investigations which are open for the public to see, so that parents can actually look and think, these people are being held to account for their actions, and there is a zero tolerance policy. And the other thing actually that's important is we can't wait for, how we say there's not many people from the BAME background in higher positions, even at the ECB at county level, but we have to not wait for these people to come to us. We actually now need to go to these people, almost like when you're at when you're at your college, university, you get lots of different professions coming out to you and telling you about their profession and how exciting it is. I think actually cricket needs to do that now. This funding that the ECB is putting in, I think, should be for going out, holding events, even if it's when, people come to the ground to watch a game, but actually holding events and educating families, parents, actively looking for players from the BAME background, actively trying to identify them so they're not lost in the system. And, and I remember when I was playing at club level, and I had a few personal problems at one point and I completely stopped playing. And one thing that I always remember is actually my coach, he's a white coach, and he actually rang me, he picked up the phone and he rang me and he said, Samara, why are you not been coming to matches for the last 3 weeks? Why have you not been training? Is everything okay? And that's still to this day, I hold that, and that's really, really important. It's like one of the examples we heard at the Equality Talk, where everybody would go out to a non-halal restaurant, so the Muslim players would either eat somewhere else by themselves, but then eventually a new coach came into the system and said, actually, you Muslim players, you're going to choose where everybody's going to go and eat, because you guys have more specific requirements. And these kind of things are important. Education is really, really important. And I think we need to go out and now try and actively get players from the BAME community. We have to actively get the trust of the parents, and make them realise that actually our sport is working really hard to make sure that everybody gets equal opportunity.
Yeah. Oh, Samara, it's been brilliant to have you on. Thank you so much for talking to us. That's Dr. Samara Afzal, who is a board member for Cricket Wales and a former Warwickshire player. We've got Anka Desayan and Carlos Brathwaite with us on 5 Live Sport. Carlos, what Samara was saying there about, how it can be really helpful for players to have people above them who are more culturally diverse, because you're talking about education. It's not just in the dressing room, isn't it? Wouldn't every player benefit from having that diversity all around them at all levels of all clubs?
Yeah, definitely. And that point, I had actually wrote a couple of notes down. And one of the things that I wanted to mention was, the mindset and the stereotyping. And it goes back to what she was saying. How many times you would hear conversations, or many people may have been privy to meetings about a promotion, and there's a person of color, they've hit all the metrics they needed to hit for promotion, and then you hear things like, I'm not sold, I'm not too sure, just don't give me a good feeling. And then there may be a white person who doesn't hit all the metrics, but you hear things around, I think we can groom him, I think he's one for the future, I think we can work with him. And right there and then, you've just elevated someone who probably doesn't deserve it, and you've castigated someone that does. And then on the flip side of that, when we get to hard forks in the road like this, where now the narrative may be token black person or token Asian person, for that one black person that makes it into that position, think about how many black or Asian persons probably deserve to be there over the number of years that would have gone by, and weren't just because of the color of their skin. So I think it's important that even if we have to start with the token black person or the token Asian person in a position of power, give them a seat at the table. When certain things are being discussed, they will have a viewpoint of someone that would have lived in the skin, someone that would have lived being diverse, someone that would have lived being discriminated against. A lot of times you have a board or a set of persons in power, all of them are white middle-aged men, and then they start to ask, how can we be more diverse? What can we do to support black and brown persons at grassroots level? And to be fair to them, they won't know. They haven't lived it. Half of them haven't experienced it. A lot of them aren't well educated on it. Why not just have someone, or a person of color, whether it be a black person, whether it be an Asian person, on that board making those decisions and actually telling you like it is, because it's something that they live day in, day out. You cannot quantify to me when I walk down the supermarket aisle and I see someone trailing me 2 and 3 aisles just because they think I can steal stuff. You can't quantify to me the feeling when I walk into elevator, there's a woman in the elevator alone and she clutches her bag. You cannot quantify that. No matter how you try to say you sympathize and it shouldn't happen, you cannot tell me as a white middle-aged man with privilege, because that's what that comes with, believe it or not. You can't tell me how that feels as a black man who more often than not just innocently just minding my business. I'm from the Caribbean. Half the times we walk in somewhere, we say good morning and everyone looks at you like, And then further to not speaking, you're clutching your purse or you're turning away and you're looking like, those are things that aren't quantifiable. No scientific metric can gauge that. But the feeling that it leaves as a black person is like, I'm a second class citizen. I can only be a thug. I can only be a gangster. And that is why you need persons in the boardroom to say, look, hold up. whatever you are proposing, I can't agree with, because as a black person, this is how this would make me feel. And it will take years. It's not something that we can do overnight, but it will take years for certain situations to come up, for persons of color to object with reason, with education, and show persons in power why certain things can't and shouldn't fly and shouldn't be implemented. Don't wait until the horse is bolted and then have inquiries, and then have hearings, and then have apologies. Because then once the apologies die down, once the hearing is gone, once the situation seems to have been rectified, the cycle starts all over again. And I didn't even know about the 2014 paper, but the fact that we had someone who wrote a paper in 2014, and in 2021 you're hearing the exact same things. It just goes to show that cycle is continuing. So how do we break that cycle?
We've got another few minutes on this. Let's move into grassroots cricket now. And we just heard the troubling statistics, actually, so I'll repeat them. These are from the ECB and Birmingham University. And this is a quote. On a conservative estimate, 30% of recreational players are of South Asian heritage, but only 4% of professional players are British South Asian. So clearly there is something happening in the middle there, which is making a big difference and a negative difference. A charity that works to help young players from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds into the sport is Platform Cricket. And from Platform Cricket, Chris Willits has joined us as well. Good evening, Chris.
Good evening.
Chris, given what you do for a living, I imagine sadly that statistic is less surprising to you.
Yeah, it's not surprising. I think for a couple of reasons. I think one, there's a lot of kind of geographical inequality, particularly around cities, and of course that's where a lot of ethnic minority populations are centred. And I think the issues that you've already spoken about in the programme, really about how kids who get into cricket more are tend to be from more privileged backgrounds, for a number of reasons, really. Partly because of the amount of money that's in the sport, partly because of the ages that people develop at. I think the obvious sort of comparison is with football, which you might kind of put as the most meritocratic sport in terms of young people developing through it. There's a lot of peculiar things about cricket, the sort of lack of divisions, or lack of complete pyramid system, lack of transfer systems. So I think those are probably the broad issues that sit behind it in terms of the sort of financial motives. But yeah, there's a lot of barriers along the way, and of course the kind of demographics within certain places. It's quite an organic thing as well, so it's ever changing. And in London, where our charity's based, we work with young people who are from very sort of uncricketing background, sort of South American heritage or African heritage backgrounds, who you're introducing completely fresh to the game, and it needs a lot of resource. It's a high cost per head for cricket to be developing kids from those backgrounds, but yeah, and considering the issues that have gone on over the last few weeks, hopefully it's something that will be looked at a bit more.
Chris, how frustrating is it from a coaching perspective? If you see a young British Asian player who has a lot of talent, you could see a player from a different, diverse Black Caribbean community as well, who has a lot of talent, a lot of ability, but they're not filtering through or getting through. What sort of barriers have you seen? Because I made a documentary with Mo and Ali and Adil Rashid a few years ago, and they talked about the fact that they had to work harder than anybody else. And they also said that their parents were juggling so many different roles and different jobs, and they had to really, push themselves more so than maybe other peers and other teammates. And they said that that's sometimes something that needs to be looked at within the Asian community. I just thought it'd be interesting to ask you to break some of that down as well, because there can be so many different types of barriers as we can sort of get into.
Yeah, you're right. There's, from our experience, there are definitely some barriers on the community side of things, and you've talked already on the programme about priorities, particularly a kind of immigrant, kind of new to the country families, and of course sport is naturally lower on the agenda sometimes the understanding of it and what's needed to go on. So I think it would be wrong to dismiss that completely. I think the barriers really, and again you've touched on this a little bit in sport, I think if you think about some of the geography of these things, so Yorkshire's obviously been in the press recently. It's a huge county, and most kids will get their first experiences of cricket through a club, in Hull or Sheffield or Barnsley, wherever it might be. And there is really very little input into what those experiences are going to be. There's very little regulation. There's very little motive for some of the clubs sometimes to do anything but beyond be a sort of private members club that's just kind of keeping its head above water. Whereas actually that they should be the tentacles of cricket and the ECB going out and being a representation in their local community, and being incentivised to be representative of their local community in terms of ethnicity, in terms of gender, in terms of everything. And that we don't see in cricket. And I think one of the big reasons is because the professional game sort of sits on top. And if you think about it, county cricket, counties are unique to cricket. It doesn't happen in any other sport. You have, in other sports, clubs that can go from the top to the bottom of the system if they're not performing well commercially, if they're not performing well in terms of their talent ID. And that's really the kind of big issue that sits behind it. It kind of breeds a little bit of complacency.
Chris, thank you as well. Chris Willits from Platform Cricket, a charity that works to help young players from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds get into the game. We're nearly out of time. Ankur Desai and Carlos Brathwaite with us. Carlos, just give us a take on what you've just heard, listening there to Chris and to Fitzroy.
I think everyone knows the problem. Is how do you change it? England have beautiful systems, I won't lie. I envy some of the systems in England with regards to information sharing and ability to get information on yourself, on opponents, video, stats, that sort of stuff, and wish we had that type of infrastructure in the Caribbean and in the West Indies. But with that information, what do you do? How do you use it? As you heard just now, not much people go to the cricket clubs that in the city, not glamorous, and to use the words of some of the more esteemed persons and persons closer to the English cricketing culture, like the boys club. If your club isn't part of the boys club, you hardly get scouts and that sort of stuff going to games. So how will you see that raw talent? How will that raw talent come through? And there's a lot more to do with it than just runs and wickets. And heard the guy just mentioned Moeen Ali and Adil Rashid, their parents doing something else. If you think about economically, if you have a parent or parents working two jobs, how can they take their kids to and from practice? How can they support them at practice? How can they be ahead of the game in gym, extracurricular activities? You find that the better sports persons play 2, 3 and 4 sports. But if I am not financially stable enough to run my household, then how can I go and pick money out my pocket to then send you to play cricket? Cricket is a very expensive sport. If you compare cricket with football, you just need a ball, any type of ball, and 4 slippers. You got 2 goal bars and a ball, and you got a game of football. With cricket, you need stumps, you need bat, you need ball. If it's hard ball, you need protection. So how can we assist persons that won't be that privileged to not only score the runs and take the wickets, but to get the assistance to be seen, and then for everything around the game of cricket, the nutrition, the fitness side of things, the access to gyms and proper gyms, the access to personnel, something like massages we take for granted. But how many players would have come up through these systems, be a fantastic fast bowler, but not have a good pair of shoes, and as a result have ankle or calf or hamstring injuries? All these things go into making it so much more difficult for a person from a very poor ethnic background to make it in a very expensive game. And then when you throw other things on top that stunts the growth of players of colour, it makes it seem almost impossible. But thankfully there are shining lights there, the Chris Jordans, Jofra Archers, Moeen Ali, Adil Rashids, that players can actually look up to now and use that to break through from one barrier to another and use as role models. But we need more of those. And how do we get 3, 4, 5 of them, black players, 3, 4, 5 of Asian players knocking at the door and being a part of the setup to add I guess, a little bit more of a push from young players who can't see a way forward because of an economic struggle.
We did ask the ECB, by the way, about coming on this programme, and they said to us that there will be this action plan released in the coming days. We started with that, Anchor. We might as well finish with that. I mean, look, we've been talking about the 100 previously and how it can, sort of get a new and young and sort of diverse audience into cricket. But the reality is, it is the sport that those people might be coming into and how it works that is the focus now. And the focus will really be on that report when it's released.
Yeah, massively so. I think I think a lot of people from the British Asian community, from the Caribbean community, will see through a lot of bland statements. And if there are people who are watching and thinking, right, I want to put my son or my daughter into cricket in the future, and if I feel as though cricket is a welcoming place, then they're going to think twice. Because frankly, I think what's happened in the last couple of weeks, as Carlos said, has set cricket back, and we could be looking at a lost generation of British Asian players, Caribbean players as well. And I think the worry is that you have so many people who are so passionate about the game. You only have to look at, I suppose, the audiences at the 100. They did tap into diverse communities, and you see the British Asians who come out and support the likes of India, Pakistan when they come over here, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and you see there's a vibrant cricket community in this country. But it has to be nurtured, and it has to be cultivated, and it has to be done honestly and transparently. And a lot of the points that Carlos has picked up on as well. I mean, I know the famous commentary says remember the name, but I think remember the message as well when it comes to what Carlos has had to say today. And I think what a lot of people have had to say today.